Section 1.4, should you believe a statistical study? So in this section, we're going to look at sources of bias. And up till this point, we've looked at some different terms, a lot of different terms, concepts related to statistics. And overall in this class, it's sometimes going to leave some people wanting, and I feel bad about that because I'd like to go into the depth that some people want, but just the nature of the curriculum of the course, it's only 3 credits. We cover a lot of different topics. So, we don't get to go as deep in any one topic as, some of you may like. And I'm going to just apologize for that right up front because, there's just not a whole lot I can do about it, unfortunately. But if you're getting into the statistics right now and you're like, man, this is like something I'm really enjoying and I wish there was more. It's kind of like when I go to a buffet and I take a sample out of the tray, put it on my plate, go back, eat it, and I'm like, wow, that was amazing. I actually want more of that. And then you go back and it's like the tray's empty, or there's not a lot in there, and it's like, you're left wanting. And I feel bad for people in this class because I think it does leave some people wanting that we don't go into the depth that maybe they would like to see. But it is just the nature of the course. We're surveying a little bit of each here. But with that aside, what we're going to start looking at now is some ways that bias might come into a study, and those sources of bias, or actual bias itself, might lead you to question the study and make you ask yourself, should I be believing this? Is this study believable? And we've already talked about the way that samples play a role in statistical study credibility, and making sure that you're collecting a sample in a good way. We looked at that a little earlier, the different ways of collecting samples. And here, this is going to still be related to the sample concept, but instead of the nuts and bolts of the different ways of collecting it, we're going to look at some sources of bias that could creep in to a sample or into a study because of your sample, and how you took your sample. So, we're going to be able to identify some sources of bias by the end of this section. And bias itself, poorly done statistical studies usually involve some sort of bias. And in statistics, you can think of bias as anything. Oops, see if I can spell here. So anything that leads to a sample that is not representative of the population. So even though you might be using some good sampling techniques, basically anything besides convenience sampling, you could still have a bad sample because of the way it was administered, the way you went out and did it. And we're going to look at these different ways. So in this class, we're going to consider 5 potential sources of bias, things that would lead to, even though you're maybe doing a nice simple random sample, that simple random sample ends up not representing the population. There's still ways to take bad samples even if you're using good techniques. So if you go into another stat class, they might have slightly different names for some of these. They might lump a couple of them together into different things. I've seen a lot of different terms as I've moved through, my teaching career and used different books. But the basic ideas behind them, even if they use different names, the ideas behind them are pretty much consistent from one class to the next. So in this one, we'll look at 5, and these kind of cover the main issues that you might see involving bias. So selection bias. The process used to select a sample excludes part of the population. So this leads to a sample that does not truly represent the population. So for example, let's say you're out there only choosing students from Lone Tree campus. For a study of CCC students. The way that you selected your sample basically is systematically excluding anyone from 4th Street, Page, online, any other place where CCC has students. You're excluding them if you're only choosing students from Lone Tree. So you're only going to really, in your sample, get the Lone Tree voice, which may not represent the whole population of CCC students. So, even if you did this randomly from Lone Tree, you're still systematically excluding all the other students who might be out there not coming to Lone Tree. So selection bias, is a pretty big one. This comes in even if you think you're doing things good. Selection bias is one of the big ones in terms of missing things. There's a famous study about a magazine that basically went under during an election many years ago because the way that they collected their sample was using telephones. And, back in that day, telephones were really only in rich households. Affluent people were the only ones that had telephones. So by only doing their study over telephones, they really systematically excluded a whole chunk of the population that did not have the money to have telephones. And in fact, in their prediction, they were really strong for this one candidate, and that candidate lost pretty badly because they didn't have a very good sample. So, and they were so ashamed by it, and basically it was so bad that magazine went under. So anyway, that's one classic example of selection bias. So non-response bias. Some of the subjects in the sample do not give a response. This means that part of the population they are supposed to represent is not given a voice. Yelp is a classic modern example of this. You go to Yelp, you're looking up a restaurant you want to go to, and you're curious what people think about it. You're going to see more than likely a whole bunch of, super strong positive, like, oh, best food ever, great service, server so-and-so was awesome, make sure you get this one, blah, blah, blah. It's just, it's like, wow, I don't know how I cannot go to this restaurant. Or you're going to see these responses where it's like, terrible food, terrible service, server so-and-so is so unattentive, blah, blah, blah. And you're like, oh, I'm never going to that thing at all. But in fact, there's probably a whole chunk of people out there who went to the restaurant and it was like, meh, it's all right. Food was okay. Service was all right. But I'm not going to go into Yelp, sign up, and write a review about it and say it was okay. So you really miss out, in those types of things on, the middle. Typically with non-response bias, what you see coming back is the extremes. The ones who really liked it, really hated it, the extreme feelings, the strong feelings. And sometimes it's just, you don't feel like sending them in. So, like with non-response bias, an example of this that is definitely something you might have experienced. Sometimes I get surveys sent to my house and I don't fill them out. But maybe you send out 100 surveys and only get 11 responses back. Well, you're missing out on 89 responses that could give you a better representation of the population. Again, with these, people are sending them in, they probably feel strongly about it, and you're not going to get that middle ground. So non-response bias, anytime you're looking at a survey and not all of them have been filled out, you're going to have that. Or pretty much anything where it's like people get to review stuff, you're probably not going to get the response of everyone who bought that product or, frequented that store or restaurant. So, you always want to take those with a little grain of salt. Biased source. If someone is paying for a study, they may want to use the collected data to further their own agenda. This means that they may skew the results in favor of something that benefits them. So a good example of this, a toothpaste company stating 9 out of 10 dentists agree. It's like, oh yeah, this got to be great toothpaste, all kinds of dentists. But, maybe it was 9 out of 100. But 9 out of 10 definitely sounds better. So they're going to use that. So you definitely want to be careful with that. They might leave something out of the report, or kick some data out in order to make their results sound better. Let's see, biased wording. Sometimes the wording of a question can cause people to respond in a certain way that doesn't truly reflect how they feel. Maybe you've seen some of these little studies or surveys out there in your experience in life. But if you had a question like this, do you prefer red shirts or blue shirts? And it's like, well, I don't prefer either one of those colors. But if those are the only two options that you have, and they want you to complete this study so that you get a nice coupon on a discount, you're going to be like, well, I guess I'll pick one of them, but it's probably not really how you feel if you don't like any one of those two colors. So, just that wording alone can make, people answer in ways that maybe isn't truthful. And the last one, a confounding variable. So if a confounding variable is present, then it could skew the results of a study and lead to incorrect cause and effect assumptions. So let's say here that you're doing a study, as the example, you're doing a study on sleeping habits. And exam performance. It might ignore other things that could affect someone's exam grade. For example, eating habits. If you haven't eaten, hard to focus. Study time. You might get all the sleep in the world, but maybe you slept through all the times you should be studying. Other distractions. Sometimes life is something you can't predict, and you get some unexpected distractions that cause you to not be able to study. And maybe those things weren't asked about as part of the study. So, you're just looking at sleep and exam. Well, there's other things that could affect it, and these other things would be confounding variables. They might mess with the results and not give you a true picture of what's going on. All right, so let's see here. I only got a few seconds left. What I want you to do is go ahead and try these 5 problems here. Identify the potential source of bias in each, And you'll have to come back to part 2 of the video for this section in order to get the answers. I'll see you there.